An alien veteran tells terrifying tales of humanity's brutal warfare. I will begin with what I thought was a malfunction in my biosensors. My name is Vreth Khan Solis. I served 4 decades in the Galactic Oversight Corps before my body finally gave me permission to stop. I have observed 41 armed conflicts across 9 star systems. I have watched species fight over land, over water, over ancient grudges nobody could fully remember. I have seen things that should have broken a mind like mine. Nothing prepared me for humans. I was stationed on Kezavar Shelf as a neutral field observer. That was my job. I watched, I recorded, I stayed out of the way. The Coalition had sent a full regiment, 400 soldiers, to clear a ridgeline held by a small human advance unit. My orders were to document the engagement for the diplomatic record. I set up my observation post before first light, checked my sensors and waited. The humans on that ridge numbered 11. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 11 against 400. Every tactical model the Corps had ever produced would have declared the engagement over before it began. The Coalition regiment had 3 armored carriers, 2 aerial support units, and a field artillery position. The humans had personal weapons, what looked like a medical kit, and each other. I remember thinking it would be quick. I remember feeling something close to sympathy for them. What happened over the next 6 hours I have never been able to fully explain in a way that satisfies other Soluvians, because the explanation requires accepting something that our biology simply does not have room for. The humans would not stop. I do not mean they were stubborn or brave in the way that soldiers of other species can be brave. I mean they were hit, and they kept going. I mean one of them took a direct impact that would have ended a Soluvian's ability to function, and he was back on his feet within minutes. My biosensors were reading catastrophic injury markers. The readout kept insisting the body in front of me could not sustain continued activity. The body in front of me disagreed. The Coalition regiment made its first push at dawn. It was textbook. Clean formation, overwhelming force, the kind of advance that should have ended in a surrender or a collapse within the first exchange. Instead, the humans let them come close, closer than any sane defensive position would allow, and then they answered with such sudden and concentrated force that the front line of the regiment actually stopped moving. Not because the humans had superior numbers. They had nothing of the sort. They stopped because the humans fought like they were not afraid of what was happening to them. I have studied fear responses in 43 sapient species. Fear is the most reliable force in warfare. It governs decision-making. It limits aggression. It tells a body when to stop. The humans on that ridge were receiving every signal that should have produced fear. My instruments were capturing elevated stress chemistry, elevated heart rates, clear neurological markers of pain. They were afraid. They simply were not letting that fear make decisions for them. The regiment pulled back to reassess. That happens. It is tactically sound. You do not keep pushing into a position that is costing you more than the models said it should. The commanding officer would have looked at his losses, compared them to the projected resistance, and concluded that something was wrong with the projection. He was correct. Something was very wrong with the projection. The second push came 2 hours later, stronger, with the aerial units moved to support positions on the flanks. It was a good response to what the commander had seen. It would have worked against any other unit in any engagement I had previously documented. One of the humans, a tall one with a wrapped injury on his left arm that my sensors said was serious, left the defensive position entirely and moved laterally along the ridge, alone, while his unit was engaged in the second push. I tracked him on my secondary sensor array because I could not understand what he was doing. He was moving toward the aerial support units, on foot, exposed. I watched him take down the first aerial unit with a shoulder-mounted device I had not seen deployed in any prior engagement. Then he moved toward the second one. He was injured. He was alone. He was going toward the greater threat rather than away from it. I filed an error report on my sensor equipment that afternoon, because I was convinced something was malfunctioning. The data I was recording did not match any model of rational behavior in my training. The Corps reviewed my equipment remotely. They confirmed everything was working correctly. The readings were right. The humans were right. My models were simply wrong. By mid-afternoon, the regiment had pulled back a second time. They were not broken as a fighting force, but they had lost something harder to measure than personnel or equipment. They had lost the certainty that the outcome was settled. And in warfare, once that certainty is gone, it becomes very difficult to get back. The commanding officer tried a third approach as the light began to change. A slow encirclement, cutting off any retreat, intending to simply outlast whatever the humans were running on. It was patient. It was intelligent. It would have worked against a force that needed hope in order to continue. The humans did not appear to need hope. They appeared to need only each other. What broke the encirclement was not a brilliant countermaneuver. It was simply the fact that the humans in the center of it kept fighting with the same intensity they had shown at dawn. For hours, without any apparent reduction in effectiveness. There was no moment of exhaustion. There was no visible despair. They just kept going, and eventually the regiment's outer perimeter began to feel the psychological weight of that, and the outer perimeter began to move in ways it was not supposed to. By the time darkness came, the regiment had lost formation. The 11 humans walked out. I do not mean they escaped through a gap. I mean they gathered themselves, checked on one another, and walked off the ridgeline in good order, carrying their equipment. 2 of them were supporting a third between them. They moved with the calm efficiency of people finishing a difficult task, not people who had just survived something that should have been impossible. I sat in my observation post for a long time after they were gone. I had documented 41 conflicts. I had seen courage and desperation and sacrifice, and all the things that sapient species do when they are pushed to the edge. But I had never seen anything like the quiet, stubborn refusal those 11 displayed. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was simply relentless, in a way that I did not have a word for in my own language. When I returned to base and submitted my report, my superior flagged it for sensor review. He said the casualty ratios I had logged were inconsistent with a believable engagement. He said, perhaps my instruments had been affected by the field conditions. I told him the instruments were fine. He marked the report as pending verification and moved on to other business. I did not sleep well for a long time after HFY Shelf. Not because the engagement had been violent, though it had been. I had seen violence before. I did not sleep well because every time I closed my eyes I kept returning to the same question, turning it over and over without finding an answer. What kind of species produces soldiers who fight like that? I would spend the next several years learning the answer to that question. I want to tell you now that the answer did not make me feel better. The answer, in fact, made everything considerably more complicated. But I am getting ahead of myself. You asked for the stories. I have more than I wish I did. Let me tell you about the tunnels of Doranafi. The thing about Doranafi that the coalition planners had relied upon was simple. The colony was almost entirely underground. Hundreds of kilometers of tunnels, carved over generations into the rock beneath the surface. The planners had looked at that geography and seen an advantage. Human forces depend heavily on sensor arrays and aerial coordination. Take away the open sky, put them in the dark, put them somewhere their equipment struggles to function, and you take away what makes them dangerous. The planners were not wrong about what makes humans dangerous in open ground. They were completely wrong about what makes humans dangerous in the dark. I was assigned to Doran IV 8 months after HFY Shelf. By then my core supervisor had stopped questioning my sensor readings, though he had started looking at me with a kind of careful pity that I found more unsettling than disbelief. I think he had begun to suspect that my time in human-adjacent theaters was changing something in me. He was not wrong about that either. The coalition forces entered the tunnel network on what was supposed to be a sweep operation. Clear the tunnels level by level, work systematically, use superior numbers to collapse any resistance. It was the kind of operation that looks excellent in a briefing room. The humans who had been stationed in those tunnels had spent 3 months in them before the coalition arrived. 3 months living and working underground, in the dark, learning every branch and junction and hollow space in that entire network. The coalition planners knew this. They considered it acceptable. 3 months in darkness was, by every model they had, a significant psychological hardship. The humans inside would be diminished, exhausted, eager for it to be over. I was in the observation corridor on level 2 when the first coalition unit made contact with the human defenders. What I saw in that first hour restructured something in how I understood warfare. The humans had discarded most of their heavy equipment, not because it had been taken from them, because they had chosen to leave it behind. In tunnels, this narrow heavy equipment is a liability. It slows you, it catches on walls, it makes noise. The humans had looked at their situation and made a cold decision to trade power for speed and silence. They were moving through those tunnels the way something born in darkness moves, easy, quiet, comfortable. The coalition soldiers were not comfortable. They had good equipment, but good equipment in a tunnel this tight is not always an advantage. Their formation lighting was too bright, which meant they could see clearly in one direction and be completely blinded from any other. Their coordination systems were struggling with the rock interference. They were fighting in someone else's home, and they knew it, and that knowledge was sitting on their shoulders every step they took. The first exchange was brief and confusing. The coalition unit reported contact and then lost the ability to specify where the contact was coming from. By the time their reports came in, the humans had already moved. That was how the next 6 weeks went. I tracked 11 separate human units across 4 tunnel levels during the Doran IV operation. What I documented across those weeks is still, even now, difficult for me to describe to someone who was not there, not because of the scale of it, The scale was actually quite small compared to many engagements I had observed. What was difficult was the texture of it, the specific details that kept adding up to something I could not fit into any category I had for warfare. The humans left things in the tunnels, not equipment, not traps, though there were those too. They left personal objects. I found a small drawing fixed to a tunnel wall with adhesive, about 40 meters past a junction that had seen heavy contact. It was a picture of what I later identified as a dog, a domestic animal humans keep as companions. Below it, someone had written a name in human script. The drawing had been there long enough that the edges had started to curl. Someone had stopped in the middle of a combat operation, in a hostile tunnel, and put up a picture of their dog. I documented it and moved on, but I kept thinking about it. I kept asking myself what it meant about the mind that had done it. Not the tactical mind, not the survival mind, the other mind. The one that needed that picture on the wall even when everything around it was danger and darkness. The central account from Doron IV, the one I have thought about more than any other, concerns a soldier whose name in the Corps records is listed only as a case file number. Though I later learned his name was Calvin. He was separated from his unit during a structural collapse on level 3, caused by coalition attempts to seal off tunnel sections. The collapse did not injure him seriously, but it cut him off completely. His communication equipment was damaged. He was alone in a section of tunnel with no reliable map, limited supplies, and no way to know if his unit was still alive. He was in that condition for 9 days. I know this because of what he left behind. When coalition forces finally cleared that section of tunnel 6 weeks after the operation ended, they found the walls of the passages Calvin had moved through covered in scratched markings, not random markings, maps. He had been moving through the tunnel system and mapping it as he went, scratching diagrams and directions and notations into the rock surface with whatever he had available. The maps were accurate. I had them cross-referenced against the actual tunnel geometry later. He had been navigating in near darkness, by memory and physical feel, and producing maps that were accurate enough to navigate by. But that is not the part that affected me. The part that affected me is that he had added notes to the maps. Not just Urshan's notes, observations. On one wall, next to a carefully scratched junction diagram, he had written something that translated roughly as, "If you find this and I did not make it out, tell my brother I was thinking about him. Tell him the fishing trip is still happening when this is done." He was alone, in the dark, producing a navigational resource for people who might find it after he was gone. He was preparing for his own death with the same practical care he had given to surviving it. He made it out. I learned this later. He found a maintenance shaft on day 7 and followed it upward until he reached a sealed access point, which he forced open on day 9, and emerged into what the records describe as a storage corridor being used as a field medical station. The medic on duty nearly had a cardiac event when he came through the wall. Calvin was treated, rested for approximately 14 hours, and then returned to active duty in the tunnel network. I read his service record years afterward. There was no extended psychological assessment following the 9 days. There was a medical check, a nutrition review, and a notation that he had reported himself fit for duty. The notation was filed by the same medic who had been so startled by his emergence from the wall. The medic's handwriting in the file is, I am told by a human archivist who helped me review the records, unusually shaky. The coalition operation on Doron IV was eventually abandoned. Not because the humans defeated the invading force in open battle. They did not. The coalition retained control of the surface and the upper levels throughout. What the coalition lost was the will to keep going down. After 6 weeks of tunnel operations, with no clear progress against an enemy that seemed to grow more capable the deeper into the dark they went, the commanding general made the decision to withdraw to a defensive surface posture and request a diplomatic solution. I submitted my observation report from Doron IV the same week. My supervisor read it, called me into his office, and asked me if I was all right. I told him I was fine. He looked at me for a long moment and then told me to take some personal leave. I did not take personal leave. I requested reassignment to the next human-adjacent theater, because by then I had started to understand that I was not going to be able to stop thinking about these people until I understood them better. And I had started to suspect, with a feeling I could not yet name, that understanding them better was not going to make things easier. Before I move on, I want to tell you one more thing about Doron IV, something that is not in my official report because I did not include it. I did not include it because I was not sure my supervisor would know what to do with it, and I was not entirely sure I did either. In the last week of the operation, before the coalition withdrawal was announced, I was moving through a secured tunnel section with a small escort when I passed a junction I had documented earlier. The junction had been the site of a significant exchange 2 weeks prior. The walls showed the marks of it clearly. Someone had painted over those marks, not hidden them, painted over them. on the section of wall that faced the direction the humans would have been coming from. The paint was rough and clearly done quickly, but the image was recognizable. It was the same dog from the drawing I had found weeks earlier. Someone had come back after the fighting and put the dog back on the wall. I do not know who did it. I do not know when or why or what it meant to them. I only know that a human soldier, in the middle of a combat operation on a hostile tunnel network, decided that a picture of a dog needed to be in that particular spot, and made sure it was there. I think about that dog more than I should. Even now, when I am old and my memory for tactical details has begun to soften around the edges, I can still see exactly what it looked like on that wall. Simple lines, the ears a little uneven, one paw slightly too large. If someone in this room ever works out what that means, I would genuinely like to know. I was not present for the Arnoth corridor. I want to make that clear before I describe it, because what I am about to tell you I reconstructed from battlefield recordings, survivor testimony, and a classified after-action report I was given access to 11 years after the event as part of a historical documentation project. I was not there, and I think if I had been there, I would not have retired when I did. I think I would have resigned immediately. The Arnoth corridor is a canyon system, roughly 40 kilometers long, carved by an ancient river through the highland rock of a contested territory I will not name for reasons that are still diplomatically sensitive. The walls are high and close. The floor is broken and uneven. There is one primary route through, and perhaps a dozen secondary passages that branch off and mostly dead end. It is exactly the kind of terrain that forces a narrow formation on anyone who enters it. The coalition forces that entered the Arnoth corridor were in pursuit. That is important. They were pursuing. For 6 days prior to the corridor engagement, coalition armored units had been pushing a human force steadily backward across open ground. The humans had been retreating consistently, fighting at each fallback position but not holding any of them, giving up territory in a way that looked, to every tactical analyst watching the engagement, like a force that was struggling to hold itself together. The coalition commander on the ground was an officer named Drev Nok. I mention him specifically because his testimony was part of the material I reviewed, and because I think he deserves to be named as someone who was doing exactly what the evidence in front of him told him to do. He was not careless. He was not arrogant. He was reading the situation correctly, with the information he had, and making the right decisions based on that information. The information he had was false. Every kilometer of ground the humans gave up during those 6 days was ground they had surveyed. Every fallback position they held briefly and then abandoned was a position that had been chosen to look like a desperate last stand, rather than calculated stop. The 2 human officers commanding the withdrawal, a man named Patrick and a woman named Claire, had planned a retreat that was not a retreat. They had designed a performance of losing for an audience of coalition tactical analysts, and they had executed it over 6 days with enough authenticity that no one watching had questioned it. Patrick and Claire needed the coalition to believe they were winning. They needed Drev Nok to feel the momentum, to feel the pressure building, to feel that the enemy was close to breaking. They needed him to pursue. He pursued. The first coalition units entered the Arnoth corridor on the morning of the 7th day. The humans they were chasing had entered it an hour before them. The formation was tight, as the terrain demanded, and moving with the energy of a force that expects to finish something. The analyst reports from that morning describe the command mood as confident. The word used in one report is eager. I have read that word in that context many times. It never gets easier. The humans the coalition was chasing reached the halfway point of the corridor and stopped retreating. They turned and they held a defensive position across the floor of the canyon with a completeness that should have been impossible for a force their size. The coalition front units met that defense and slowed, and then stopped and then began to push, and found that pushing was harder than it should have been. While the front was engaged, the sides of the canyon began to matter. The human forces that had been waiting in the secondary passages, some of them for 4 days, began to emerge. I want you to understand the planning that required 4 days. Soldiers sitting in narrow canyon branches in complete silence, with minimal supplies, waiting for 6 days of false retreat to work, waiting for the corridor to fill. They had gone in before the retreat even began, slipping into their positions in the dark before anyone was looking, then disappearing from every sensor reading under layers of rock and carefully managed emissions discipline. They were not reserves. They were the trap. They had been the trap from the beginning. The coalition column could not move backward quickly. The terrain would not allow it. The tight formation that had been an asset on pursuit became a liability the moment the walls came alive. Units at the rear of the column were engaged before units at the front fully understood what was happening. Communication between sections of the column became confused, then fragmented. Drev Nok was in the middle of the column. In his testimony, which I read in its entirety, he describes the first minutes of the ambush with a precision that speaks to his professionalism even under those circumstances. He was trying to understand and respond. He was issuing orders. He was doing his job. He describes the moment he understood what had happened as the quietest moment of his life. Not because it was actually quiet. The corridor was not quiet. He describes a sudden internal silence, the specific silence of a mind that has just fully comprehended something it cannot change. The coalition column was destroyed as a fighting force in approximately 4 hours. Drevnock survived. Some percentage of his personnel survived, escaping through gaps in the canyon walls that the humans, I believe deliberately, had not fully sealed. A complete encirclement with no escape would have produced a different kind of engagement, a longer and more costly one. Patrick and Claire, or whoever made the final call on the plan, had left a door, not out of weakness, out of calculation. A trapped force fights until it cannot. A force that can flee sometimes chooses to. The human losses in the Arnath corridor were significantly lower than their losses during the 6 days of false retreat. That is the sentence I have turned over more times than almost any other in my career. The 6 days of giving ground, of performing desperation, of absorbing the cost of a retreat that was not really a retreat. Those days cost them more than the ambush. They accepted that cost deliberately. They planned it into the operation. They chose to take the harder losses at the front end, so that the losses at the back end would be lower. I am going to say something now that I said to my corps supervisor when I first briefed him on my findings, and which caused him to request a second medical evaluation of my fitness for duty. Those soldiers at the front of the false retreat, the ones making it look real, the ones absorbing real losses to sell the performance they knew. Patrick and Claire did not hide the plan from them. In the documents I reviewed, there is an account of the briefing given to the lead withdrawal units before the operation began. They were told what was happening. They were told they would be the ones taking the pressure while the trap was built. They were told that the plan was designed to minimize total losses, which meant front-loading the cost. They agreed, every one of them. No coercion is recorded. No significant dissent is noted. They were asked to carry the weight of the opening act so the ending would cost less overall, and they said yes. I have asked myself many times what kind of unit culture produces that answer. What kind of trust between soldiers? What kind of shared values? What kind of understanding of collective purpose makes a group of individuals look at a plan that asks them to absorb the hard part and say yes without hesitation? I have not found a satisfying answer. I am not sure there is one that my mind is built to hold. What I can tell you is what the after-action report noted in its summary. The report was written by a human military historian attached to the operation. She was documenting it for their own internal records. She wrote several pages of tactical analysis. At the very end, in what appears to have been a personal addition rather than official summary, she wrote a single paragraph that I memorized the first time I read it and have not been able to forget since. She wrote that what distinguished the Arnath operation was not the planning, which she called excellent, but not unprecedented. What distinguished it was the depth of trust that made the planning possible. You cannot build a trap that requires 6 days and significant front-loaded cost, she wrote, unless the people at the front trust absolutely that the people behind them are worth the cost. That trust is not built in a briefing room. It is built over years of being the kind of organization that keeps its word to its people. I read that paragraph to my supervisor during the briefing. He was quiet for a while. Then he said very carefully that he thought I should probably take that leave he had mentioned earlier. I told him I would consider it. I did not take it. I had more theaters to observe. And by then I was beginning to understand that the thing I was really trying to learn was not how humans fought. It was why. And the why was something I was not going to find in tactical reports and sensor readings alone. The why, I was starting to suspect, was going to require me to look at what they did when they were not fighting. That investigation led me to the strangest discovery of my career. I want to ask you something before I continue. Think about the most difficult, the most frightening, the most genuinely overwhelming situation you have personally experienced. Think about what your mind did in that situation, what your instincts reached for, whether you went quiet or loud, whether you needed distraction or focus or the sound of a familiar voice. Now imagine that in the middle of that situation, someone near you started to sing. I do not mean humming to manage anxiety. I mean singing, a real song, with words, performed with genuine investment, at reasonable volume, in the middle of conditions that every instinct in your body should be telling you are not appropriate for music. What would you think of that person? I will tell you what I thought. When I first accessed the intercepted communication files from the Doranofi Theater, the long-range recordings that Coalition Signal Intelligence had gathered from human command channels during the tunnel operation, I thought there had been a filing error. I was sitting in a records room at a regional base, reviewing hundreds of hours of captured audio, and I kept encountering musical recordings mixed in with what I expected to be tactical communications, supply requests, and command discussions. I flagged it for the archivist. She checked the file index and confirmed there was no error. The musical content was part of the human communication record. They had been transmitting it themselves between units, as routine traffic. I went back through the files more carefully after that. What I found across approximately 300 hours of captured human communication from Doran Fee, supplemented later by similar records from 4 other theaters I reviewed as part of the historical project, was something that I genuinely did not have a category for in my understanding of warfare. The humans made things. I do not mean they built fortifications or maintained equipment. I mean they produced creative work, under sustained operational pressure, in conditions that my training told me should suppress all higher cognitive functions to focus purely on survival responses. They wrote songs and drew pictures, and told what and made jokes, and passed all of it to each other, through whatever communication channel was available. One unit on level 4 at Doran IV, a logistics team of 8 people that had been cut off from the main force for 11 days during the heaviest period of the tunnel operation, collectively wrote and performed a theatrical piece. I have the recording. It runs to approximately 40 minutes. It is a comedy about a group of soldiers who are trying to organize a formal dinner in a tunnel with no food, no chairs, no light, and an increasingly absurd series of obstacles. The acting is energetic, the writing is sharp. 2 of the performers are clearly enjoying themselves enormously. I will not read it to you. I have my reasons for that, which I will explain in a moment. What I want to convey is the scientific and tactical significance of what that recording represents. Every model the Corps had of cognitive function under sustained stress showed a consistent pattern across all species we had studied. Creative output falls. The mind narrows its focus to immediate survival requirements. Art, humor, and complex social expression are energy expenditures that a stressed mind should, according to every model, defer or eliminate. The humans were not following the model. In fact, what I found when I started organizing the data more systematically was that the direction was reversed. The most creative material I encountered, the most complex songs, the most carefully constructed jokes, the most elaborate shared stories, came from units under the heaviest and most sustained pressure. Not the units having an easy time. The units having the hardest time. A soldier named Owen, whose file I reviewed later, was embedded with a forward observation team that spent 22 days in a contested tunnel section at Doran. During those 22 days, he wrote 17 songs, 17, not fragments, complete compositions with verses and repeated sections, some of them quite long. He had no instrument. He sang them quietly to his unit mates during rest periods, and transmitted rough recordings to adjacent units when the channels were open. I listened to all 17. It took me the better part of an evening. I will tell you what they were about, because the content matters. They were about his home, about the city he grew up in, about a specific street in that city where there was a bakery that opened very early in the morning and the smell of it carried for half a block, about his older sister, who had apparently made it her life's work to argue with him about everything, and who he described in one song with a level of detailed affection that I found unexpectedly and without warning, quite moving. The songs were not about fighting. They were not about survival. They were about the world he had left behind and intended to return to, and he was keeping that world alive by describing it, in music, to people who were a long way from anything they loved. I sat with that for a long time. Other species under pressure reach backward or inward. They go quiet, they conserve, they endure. The humans under pressure reached outward. They built, they shared what they built. They created a collective experience of something beyond the situation they were in, and then passed it around like food. I thought about this for months after I first encountered it, and I eventually came to a conclusion that I want to share with you carefully, because it is not a tactical observation. It is closer to something philosophical. A species that responds to extreme pressure by creating shared meaning is a species that cannot be broken the same way other species break. You can exhaust other species. You can isolate them and overwhelm them and take away everything that gives them comfort, and at some point the weight of that becomes too much, and something in the collective will snaps. Every other species I had observed in sustained conflict showed a threshold. Push past it and the will to continue collapses. I do not believe humans have that threshold in the same location. Because the mechanism that other species rely on to survive extreme pressure, the internal reserves, the private coping, the individual endurance, is not the only mechanism humans use. They have an additional one. They make something and give it to the person next to them. And that act, that small act of creation and sharing, seems to do something to the collective that I cannot fully quantify but that I watched work, repeatedly, in recorded condition after recorded condition. The humans in Owen's unit came out of those 22 days in significantly better psychological condition than every model predicted. The after-action psychological assessments noted this as anomalous. The assessors flagged it for follow-up study. One of them wrote in the margin of the file, in handwriting that someone had later translated for the archive record, that the unit had apparently been singing a lot. The word apparently was underlined. I think the assessor was not sure whether to find this reassuring or strange. I want to return to the theatrical piece from the logistics unit, the comedy about the dinner in the tunnel. I said I would explain why I will not read it to you. I tried to read it aloud once. 2 years after I first found the recording, I was presenting my research on human morale resilience to a small internal core audience, and I thought including it would illustrate the point more vividly than any analysis could. I got through the first 8 minutes. I want to be precise about what happened. I did not stop because the content was distressing. I stopped because the content was funny, genuinely funny. The writing was good enough, and the performances were committed enough, that I found myself laughing, and then I found myself unable to continue because I was also thinking about where those 8 people were when they performed it, and what was outside the walls of their tunnel, and the combination of those two things produced an emotional response I was not prepared for in a professional setting. I cleared my throat, explained that time constraints required me to summarize the remaining content, and moved on. My colleague who attended that presentation asked me afterward what had happened. I told her I had lost my place. She gave me the same look my supervisor had given me years before, the careful, pitying look of someone who has noticed that a person is not entirely all right, but does not know what to do with that observation. The 8 people from the logistics unit all survived Doron Forv. I confirmed this through the historical archive. They mustered out at different times over the following years. I have no information about where they are now, or whether they are still alive. They are, if they are human, quite old by this point. I hope they had a good dinner eventually, a real one, with chairs and light. I hope the person who played the increasingly exasperated dining coordinator, whose comic timing in the recording is, I will say without reservation, genuinely impressive, had many occasions to make people laugh in the years that followed. I think about that recording more than is probably healthy for an old Corps veteran who is supposed to have made peace with his career by now. I think about Owen's songs. I think about the dog on the wall. A species that sings in the dark is a species that carries something inside it that hardship cannot reach. I do not know what you call that thing in your own language. In mine, the closest word I have translates roughly as the fire that does not need wood. I think that is what humans have. I think they carry it into every dark place they go. I do not think it can be taken from them. I think anyone who tries to take it from them is going to learn that lesson the hard way. I had not planned to tell you this last part. When I agreed to speak at this seminar, I prepared 4 accounts: the HFY shelf, the Dorana 4 tunnels, the Arnath corridor, the communication files, and what the humans made in the dark. 4 accounts, each one chosen because it illustrated something specific about human capability that I believed would be useful for the soldiers in this room to understand. I did not plan to tell you what I am about to tell you because I have not told it to anyone, not my supervisor, not my colleagues in the historical project, not the Corps medical officer who evaluated me after my retirement, not even my family. It is not in any official record. It exists only in my memory, and since my memory is getting less reliable with each passing year, I have decided that if I am going to tell it to anyone, I should do it now, while I can still be certain I am telling it accurately. The ceasefire that ended the conflict in the human-adjacent theater, where I spent the last years of my observation posting, was announced on what the Corps calendar records as the 142nd day of that year. I was at a forward diplomatic post, included in the observer delegation as a record keeper. My role in the ceasefire process was to document the preliminary logistics meetings, the practical discussions about demarcation lines and prisoner exchanges, and the movement of displaced personnel. It was administrative work, important but not dramatic. I was good at it, and I did not expect it to matter much. I was assigned a human military liaison for the 3 days of preliminary meetings. His name was Nathan. He was a senior officer, and he had, as I learned in the first hour of working with him, served in all 3 of the primary theaters I had spent the last years documenting. HFY Shelf, Dorana 4th, the Arnath corridor. He had been present for all of them. I knew this because he told me directly, in the first few minutes of our introduction, with a calm straightforwardness that I found both professional and slightly disorienting. He said he understood I had been the Corps observer attached to several engagements he had been involved in. He said he thought that might make our working relationship either easier or more complicated, and he was happy to discuss it whichever way I preferred. I told him I preferred efficient and professional. He said that worked for him too. For 2 days we worked well together. Nathan was organized, precise, and notably free of the hostility I had encountered from some human officers in prior diplomatic contexts. He asked me practical questions about core documentation requirements. I asked him practical questions about human demobilization procedures. We drank the same terrible synthesized beverage that both our species could tolerate and spent long hours in a small conference room, making sure the preliminary logistics held together. On the second evening after the formal session had ended, we were finishing the last of the paperwork when Nathan asked me something I had not expected. He asked if I had ever been to Solus, my homeworld, during the conflict period, or whether I had been in the field continuously. I told him I had been in the field for most of the preceding 4 years, with only brief returns to regional bases. He said he thought that was a long time to be away from home. I said it was the job. He nodded slowly and said yes. He knew something about that. There was a pause, not an uncomfortable one. The kind of pause that exists between two people who have both been doing something very serious for a long time, and have suddenly, unexpectedly, found a moment of stillness. He asked if I had family waiting for me on Solus. I told him I did. 2 adult children and a spouse who had been extraordinarily patient with the demands of my career. He smiled. He said that was good. He said patience in a family was not something to take for granted, and that he had spent a significant portion of the past 4 years being grateful for it. I asked if he had family. He told me about them for a few minutes. A partner he had been with for 12 years. A younger brother who had apparently inherited all the common sense in their family and put it to use running a small agricultural operation, somewhere far from any conflict zone, which Nathan described with a warmth that was clearly genuine. A dog, elderly now, who was reportedly still waiting for him despite having developed an impressive list of health complaints in his absence. I told him I hoped the dog held on. He said he thought she would. He said she was stubborn. There was another pause. Then Nathan said, without any particular change in tone, as if he were continuing a logistical discussion, "I know who you are." I looked at him. He said he did not mean it as a threat or as an accusation. He said he meant that he had known, from the moment my name appeared on the liaison assignment, that I was the Corps observer who had been posted at HFY. I asked him how he knew that. He said that on day 7 of the time he spent in the tunnels of HFY, separated from his unit, navigating in near darkness through a section of the network that had been destabilized by coalition sealing operations, he had found a maintenance shaft and followed it. The shaft ended at a sealed access point in what appeared, from the sounds on the other side, to be an occupied space. He had pressed himself against the wall next to that access point and listened. Through the material of the wall, he had heard 2 voices. One was clearly mechanical, a translation relay of some kind. The other was a Soluvian vocal pattern. He had recognized it because he had been briefed extensively on Soluvian physiological characteristics before deployment, and the distinctive resonance of a Soluvian voice is not easily mistaken. He had understood immediately that what he was hearing was a Corps observer station. He said he had stayed there for a long time, listening, understanding that there was a door in front of him that he could potentially open. That on the other side of it was a non-combatant, someone who had no part in the conflict, someone who, by every rule of the engagement and every agreement his side had signed, was protected. He had listened for approximately 40 minutes. Then he had moved on, going further through the shaft until he found the access point that eventually led him to the medical corridor. He looked at me across the small table covered in logistics paperwork. He said, "I want you to know that I knew you were there, and I decided that it mattered that you were an observer, not a combatant. I decided that the difference was important, and I was not going to be the one who made it stop being important." I sat with that for a moment. I want to describe as accurately as I can what happened inside my mind during those few seconds of silence. I had spent years documenting human warfare. I had watched them fight in ways that defied every model I had for sapient behavior. I had watched them take losses that should have broken any unit's will and come through with their cohesion intact. I had watched them plan on a scale and with a patience that required trusting each other completely. I had listened to them sing in the dark. I had read the maps scratched on the walls by a man alone in a tunnel who wanted to leave something useful behind in case he did not come out. I had understood in the abstract that humans were capable of extraordinary things. I had not understood until that moment that the same capacity that made them so formidable also included the ability to stop, to draw a line, alone in the dark with no one watching, and choose not to cross it. Nathan was not going to tell anyone about that decision. There was no record of it anywhere. No commendation was possible because no one knew. He had made a choice in a dark tunnel that cost him nothing material and could have gained him something, and he had made it not because he expected recognition, but because he had decided that the principle involved was worth keeping even when, Keeping it was inconvenient. I told him, eventually, that I had not known he was there. He said he supposed I wouldn't have. He said the maintenance shaft material was quite thick. I asked him why he was telling me. He thought about that for a moment. Then, he said he was telling me because the ceasefire was signed, and the war was over, and he thought that the people who had been on different sides of it deserved, where possible, to know the truth about what had happened between them. He said he thought secrets had a way of becoming weight, and he had been carrying this one long enough that it seemed right to set it down. He picked up the last of the logistics documents and went back to reviewing the demarcation line specifications. We finished the paperwork. We shook hands at the end of the third day. His grip was firm and brief in the human manner. He thanked me for the efficient documentation. I thanked him for the same. I watched him walk out of the conference room with the easy stride of someone who has been doing a hard thing for a long time and is ready finally to stop. I stood there for quite a while after he left. I have been asked in the years since to summarize my conclusions about human warfare, to distill what I observed into something useful, something that the Corps and the Coalition and the broader galactic community could take away and apply. I have given talks. I have written reports. I have answered questions from researchers and analysts and strategists who wanted to understand the human military character. I have always given useful answers. I have always had useful things to say about their endurance, their adaptability, their unit cohesion, their creative resilience, their extraordinary capacity for complex deception, and equally extraordinary capacity for sacrifice. I have never told anyone about Nathan in the tunnel. I am telling you now. Not because it is tactically useful, it is not. It does not change any of the numbers, or improve any of the models. I am telling you because I think it is the most important thing I know about humans. More important than any of the battles. More important than the songs or the maps or the tactical brilliance of the Arnath corridor. They decided, somewhere in their history, that the way you fight matters, not just the outcome, the way, the method, the line you draw and hold even when no one is watching, and there is no consequence for crossing it. They went to extraordinary lengths to win. I documented that. I saw it. I lived in proximity to it for years, and I am still not sure I fully understand the scale of it. And then, alone in a dark tunnel, one of them decided that extraordinary lengths had a limit, and held the limit. I do not know what that makes them. I know it makes them something I have spent 30 years trying to find the right word for. I am an old soldier now. I wake up some mornings and I can still hear Owen's songs in my memory, the ones about the bakery and his sister. I still see the dog on the wall. I still think about Calvin's maps and the scratched note about the fishing trip. I still think about 8 people performing a comedy in a tunnel to make each other laugh, when laughter was the furthest thing from reasonable. I still think about Nathan's footsteps moving away down a dark maintenance shaft. 30 years, and I still do not have the right word. The closest I have found, in all the languages I have access to, is something from the human tradition itself. A human philosopher, writing during an earlier period of conflict in their own history, used a phrase that I encountered in an archive I was reviewing late one night when I could not sleep. He wrote that some things are worth doing not because they change the outcome, but because they are the thing a person of character does. He was writing about something specific to his own time and place. He was not writing about tunnels or ceasefires or alien observers on the other side of a sealed door. But I have read that phrase more times than I can count, and every time I read it, I think of Nathan. I think of 11 soldiers walking off a ridge. I think of a dog painted on a tunnel wall. I think of a young soldier scratching a message into rock for someone he might never meet, in case he did not make it out, making sure the fishing trip was still on the record. I think of all of it, and I do not know whether to be afraid of this species or grateful for it. I think if I am being honest, I am both. That is all I have for you today. I do not take questions.